What is the best way to get to my heart? Hero stories. It's hard to tell where my fascination with heroes begins and ends, but aside from just spending a whole bunch of time with various comics as a kid, I think the real reason I love the idea of heroes is just the idea of being an inspiration, making people want to do better, being a positive influence to someone, making a difference. As a creator, I think that's what drives me the most, knowing that at some emotional level you can connect with people and give them the inspiration to either be better people or pursue a similar path in life. Heroes have commonly been a fantastic vector for that. Even though I've always been a fan of superhero aesthetics, it wasn't until Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies that I truly ended up learning the value of heroism as a concept and why people love them so much. Those movies, the second one in particular, delved into themes of power and responsibility, as well as why people need heroes. It's been something that stuck with me ever since I was a kid, so whenever a movie or game tries to tell some kind of story about a hero rising against the odds, chances are I'll be entirely on board with what you're trying to do. I'm not ashamed to admit that I probably teared up at a whole bunch of moments in media that play up inspirational moments like those to some incredibly sincere effects. That's going to be an incredibly important word going on in this video: sincerity. Back in the first episode of this show, I talked about the DKC series and how particularly the second game tried to establish a theme of you, the underdog, rising to the occasion. In the preceding episode, I talked about a fantastic overlooked gem that was part of the infamous Capcom 5 initiative. Both of those games covered were games I listed as some of my favorite games of all time, and today I'm going to be going deep into detail on a very special game to me. One that, were you to hold me at gunpoint about the question, is probably the very game I'd call my one favorite game of all time. A game that combines everything I love about video games: design, presentation, mechanics, and story, to fantastic effect, and much like Killer 7, it happens to be a game that was also part of the Capcom 5 initiative. Who'd have thought that, eh?
Oh, me? Viewtiful Joe.
If I've ever come across as a fanboy during these videos I've made, you're gonna have to forgive me in advance for the sheer level of investment I'll most likely be exhibiting during this game. Viewtiful Joe is a game I keep returning to at least once a year. It's a game I play not only for positive reinforcement, but for a legitimate challenge. I hope to be able to properly explain why it means so much to me and why it's such a great game, but before that, let's look a little bit at the game's background. As previously mentioned, this game was developed under the Capcom 5 initiative, a sort of colloquial term for 5 games that were revealed in an unprecedented push to combat Nintendo's waning third-party relationships. Those 5 games were Resident Evil 4, PN03, Killer 7, Viewtiful Joe, and the cancelled Dead Phoenix. Other than GameCube exclusivity, the other thing linking the games together was that Shinji Mikami was involved with all those titles to some degree, whether it was directing, producing, or just overseeing their development. With the exception of Killer 7, all these games were developed in-house by Capcom, but the deal ended up falling apart as all games except PN03, which was a commercial and critical failure, would eventually lose their exclusivity, even though Capcom would eventually claim that Resident Evil 4 was the only game that was meant to be exclusive in the first place. Responsible for heading Viewtiful Joe was Hideki Kamiya, a full-time game director and part-time Twitter tour de force. Prior to Viewtiful Joe, Kamiya worked on Resident Evil as a planner, and he also ended up being the director of the game's sequel. Despite there being a lot of creative differences between Kamiya and series creator Shinji Mikami that led to Mikami taking a more hands-off approach, Mikami decided to ask Kamiya to make what was initially supposed to be Resident Evil 4. The end result was a game so drastically different from the Resident Evil formula that in the end they decided to create a brand new franchise out of it, and that franchise ended up becoming Devil May Cry. With that, you could argue that Kamiya single-handedly gave birth to the character action combat genre. Combos, stylish action, twitch reactions, and improvisation became the hallmarks of not just the game, but an entire subgenre. Which makes it all the more surprising that when Capcom fast-tracked a sequel, they didn't want Kamiya to have anything to do with it. In fact, they never clued him into the existence of a sequel, something which he's expressed visible disappointment with in the past. While Devil May Cry 2 was left to be assembled with a box of scraps, Capcom wanted to appoint Kamiya and some other key players from Team Little Devils, such as Atsushi Inaba, to a staff-focused project meant to increase their talents as game developers. Within that was a stipulation to deliver a game within 12 months, but as the team ended up growing and the game kept impressing the producers, they overextended their deadline, allowing Kamiya to deliver a game that defied every expectation. That game was Viewtiful Joe, a game which came from Kamiya and Inaba's mutual love for heroes, tokusatsu, and comics. Anyway, that's one hell of a history lesson. When I first experienced Viewtiful Joe, it was a time when I was only just starting to learn about a wider gaming community thanks to a whole bunch of gaming magazines I used to read as a kid. GameCube wasn't as popular of a console as its competitors, so when I once got a special E3 2003 issue of an old Swedish magazine which was bundled with a DVD of trailers, I was kind of saddened that there wasn't a whole lot of GameCube games on there that looked to captivate my interest. Except one. At a time when the only live footage of games I'd ever get to experience before actually getting them was from TV adverts, Viewtiful Joe was the first video game trailer I ever got to really see for myself. I watched that trailer and instantly fell in love. I would watch that trailer almost religiously. That was the first game trailer I think I ever really fawned over as a kid, since it looked at everything I could possibly hope for. A fantastic lead character, a remarkable visual style, some awesome looking action. I was floored by how fun and colorful it looked, and I was also surprised by it being a 2D side-scroller, considering I thought that was a style of games lost in between generations. And it was a superhero game, something I've always been wanting to get. Needless to say, this was a game I knew I instantly wanted, and once I eventually got the game, it instantly decimated every expectation I could possibly have. It's remained a fixture within my life of gaming and has a lot of things that ooze gaming perfection. So what makes Viewtiful Joe so great? Well, there's a lot of ground to cover, and much of that ground is going to involve heavily deconstructing just what it is that makes Kamiya's games as a whole feel so special. We're going to go much deeper into him later, but for now let's just do a quick run through of the premise. The game's story revolves around a late teen young adult named Joe, a guy whose only real defining feature is his unhealthy love for movies. While on a date with his girlfriend Sylvia, they go see a movie based on his absolute favorite superhero, Captain Blue. However, after a scene where Captain Blue is seemingly vanquished, the movie's antagonist abducts Sylvia while Joe gets taken by Captain Blue's mech. While inside the movie, the spirit of Blue reaches out to Joe, as it's now up to him to become the hero of Movieland and save Sylvia. Being granted a V-Watch, Joe is bestowed the power of a hero, and with a simple utterance of his catchphrase, he transformed into the red-hot wonder that we eventually come to know as Viewtiful Joe.
Head to the go-go, baby! You want some? Well, come and get it!
Now, pardon the abrupt diversion here, but I'm going to jump headlong into one of this game's absolute mainstream straight off the bat, because this is one of those strokes of genius that I've already talked about once on this channel before. When I talked about the Donkey Kong series on this channel, I made the point that a good sign of a game that is defined by something far deeper than just the exterior and the set dressing is when you can make all of the game's presentation be informed by some stellar structure and mechanics. Everything needs to feel unified and nothing needs to feel like it was added just to make a useless visual point. Now let's take a look at Viewtiful Joe. The gameplay of Viewtiful Joe takes place within the world of movies, and each chapter, as it were, is defined more as if it were an individual movie with intermissions in between key moments, and ending chapter narration that talks to the audience as if it were a trailer or teaser for the sequel or next episode of a running series. Heck, the game even names its difficulty setting in forms of movie or audience ratings. Your health in the game is represented by fast food you might have at the set or find at theater vendors. Pickups come in form of film canisters that boost your effects reel, and much of the environment is composed of two-dimensional stage backdrops. This game, right off the bat, absolutely nails presentation on every conceivable level. That said, as much as it succeeds in building a world themed around movies, it wouldn't have mattered nearly as much if it didn't have some damn good gameplay to go along with it. And really, Viewtiful Joe has to have one of the most meta-conscious gameplay systems I've ever experienced. The game is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and while Kamiya has a pretty varied gamography to his name, it's safe to say that he's most known for his character action games. Most of these games are heavily built around maintaining combo strings through smooth controls of directional inputs, heavy usage of juggling and aerial combat, and finally a high emphasis on dodging as opposed to blocking. Joe is able to punch, kick, dodge, and jump his way through the obstacles and encounters that lie in his wake. All of these elements are fairly straightforward and make for an average beat-em-up when taken on their own, but then the game digs into the main gimmick of the game itself, the V-Watch. Joe's signature power isn't anything as glamorous as super strength, speed, or flight. His main superpower is being able to control the movie's actual framing devices. Joe is a character who loves cinema as much as he also loves to show off, and fittingly enough, his power allows him to get more power by doing exactly that. With the V-Watch, he gains 3 main abilities. The one you'll find yourself using the most is slow. By slowing down the movie's speed, Joe's punches and kicks not only end up looking more powerful, but they become more powerful. Dodging enemies and stunning them becomes far easier and blows enemy defenses wide open, allowing you to wipe hordes of enemies for as long as your VFX gauge will allow you to. The second ability Joe gets is his signature Mach Speed ability. By speeding up the movie, Joe moves so fast that he not only manages to rip through enemies but also create after images that will lock on into other enemies in the area or props that are in the background. Finally, his third ability is Zoom. By centering the camera all around him for attention, Joe is able to do some fancier attacks which include sweeping area of effect moves that attack multiple enemies in his surroundings. The amazing thing about the VFX moves is not only the depth and options they add to battle, but also how adaptable they are. In contrast to Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, you don't need to worry about many real specific combos or all too many specific button inputs in this game, since Joe's abilities boil down to punching and kicking, along with some special moves for each of those, and a few usable projectiles. Viewtiful Joe ends up having a really low skill floor, but the skill ceiling becomes incredibly high due to how much VFX is used in conjunction with those mechanics and then expanded upon. For example, if Joe's Mach speed can be maintained for long enough in enemy encounters, Joe can build up an aura of heat that renders him immune to fire and allows him to ignite enemies. Joe's slow ability allows him to intercept bullets being shot at him and actually allows him to punch or kick the bullets back at the enemies, but it also allows him to counter explosions and power them up against enemies too. Zoom can be combined with slow to do incredible damage and also manipulate some other moves for even greater effects. The combat becomes an elegant dance of timing and adaptation based on few simple buttons, and it manages to make you feel incredibly empowered in the process. The usage of VFX isn't just limited to combat, however, since it becomes an integral part of the game's puzzles and progressing through the stages. By utilizing the VFX through various capacities in the actual stages, whether it be creating wind currents or slowing down a treacherous obstacle, the game manages to make them feel like they're second nature, making them almost entirely seamless. The gameplay in Viewtiful Joe is almost perfectly paced, and when it introduces a new enemy and learning how to deal with them through their visual cues, whether it be finding out a certain pattern behind their continuous attacks, when there's a certain move of theirs that you can counter, or which VFX will be best suited for the job in tackling them. The most interesting thing I found while replaying on higher difficulties was how the game would feel relentlessly difficult by increasing damage received and removing the hints at what directions to dodge and counter, but with enough perseverance I realized taking it slow and finding the patterns in their movements would eventually allow me to figure out how to best those seemingly insane obstacles every time I step up the difficulty curve. It's a game that teaches you through observation, fittingly enough since it is a game about movies, and through the sheer elegance and brevity of its own deceptive simplicity, it has plenty of ways to make you feel incredibly empowered no matter your skill level. But what makes Viewtiful Joe so special alongside its immediate premise and its fantastic gameplay is a trait that I mentioned near the start of the video and which we're going to take a closer look at now. Let's take a closer examination of Hideki Kamiya's traits as a director under the scope. Even outside of his character action games, there's usually never any doubt that there's a certain distinct flavor or creator's touch that's pertinent toward the games he makes. If you'd had to answer the question, what defines Kamiya's games? Well, I imagine you get a lot of answers. Cheesy dialogue, boss rushes, Space Harrier homages, reference to his older works, a hearty dose of camp? Well, yeah, I suppose all of them qualify. But in a more broad context, I'd say that one thing that defines Kamiya's games is his unmistakable level of sincerity. Setting aside what Kamiya's social media feed might make you think of him, there's no doubt that he infuses his games with so much care that it's hard to get the impression that he has anything but utmost love for what he does, the worlds he depicts, and even his own sources of inspiration. As an example, usually it's possible to get the impression from movies and games that pop culture references are a cheap exploit for some easy laughs, but whenever many of Kamiya's games reference anything of his own or someone else's, it tends to do so in earnest ways that only exist to highlight his own love and interest for the medium rather than attempt at garnering sympathy. Most of his games are also fairly aware of its own publisher, such as when Viewtiful Joe makes a reference to Mega Man or when Bayonetta references Afterburner. I'd almost like to say even the fact that most of his games' development crews end up referring to themselves very specifically, such as Team Little Devils or Team Viewtiful, even shows how much pride and love they have for the games they do. A trait I often dispute with many depictions of things that are in Viewtiful Joe, or really a whole lot of other media with a relentless level of optimism and love, is that they're defined by their campy nature, and I'm not sure I'm fully in agreement on that. As ridiculously cheesy as this kind of media might get, and as much as that contributes to a fun feeling, I think it's ultimately the sincerity of its message and intent that makes it more than just a goof that we can laugh at, and why they continue to resonate with people. Anyone can make a hero design and call it a day, but ultimately the reason we revere those designs is because above all else, they're good characters that people love and relate to. Again, you can look back on Raimi's Spider-Man movies as an example of how incredibly goofy things might get, because, well, that's kind of the medium and actors we're dealing with here, but ultimately their message is one of honesty and inspiration told through characters that people relate and sympathize with, that you really don't need to appreciate just because of some adherence to irony. Instead, it's ultimately the strength of its sincerity that keeps it afloat. This same spirit is what pervades Viewtiful Joe, a game that knows how cheesy, tongue-in-cheek, and over the top it is, but still has a heart at its center that infuses everything with actual meaning. It's just as much of a game about a superhero named Joe as it is a game about you being a hero. I mean, it's right there in the protagonist's name, with the title clearly being a play on the term Average Joe. So let's dig into the game's theming and story a little deeper. This is going to cross over a little bit with some more expanded look on the things encountered in gameplay due to how much of the gameplay informs the story, so things might get a little bit broad. After dispatching some cheap tutorial fodder, you soon encounter the spirit of Captain Blue, who serves as something of a recurring exam of skill mini-boss battle. After beating him the first time in a pretty much unlosable battle, he sees your potential of being a hero, and it's only then when you're able to don a signature red hot outfit that gives you your powers. Each subsequent encounter of Captain Blue serves as a sort of checkpoint or signifier of a difficulty increase, and every time you beat him you unlock a new VFX ability. By bringing Blue into the mix, the game gives us a clear indication of whose talents it is we need to surpass, and every time we encounter him he gets more challenging. This becomes important for later eventually, but let's talk about the other counters in intervening time. The plot of the story starts with the straightforward premise that eventually, as the game itself acknowledges, gets a share of pragmatic twists when we encounter some of the bosses in the game, with the twists relating particularly of the nature behind Sylvia's kidnapping and the movie character's seeming awareness of the fact that the world they live in isn't a real one. Joe's knowledge of the two separate worlds forces the antagonist of the game to break the kayfabe and treat him as more of a credible threat, and so we're introduced to a cavalcade of memorable, crazy characters that embody Monster of the Week tropes. The music is brilliant. The soundtrack was composed by Masami Ueda of Devil May Cry and Masakazu Sugimori of the first Ace Attorney game. More than just being a hero game, but a game built around character, this soundtrack builds itself heavily around leitmotifs. Joe and Blue have an associated theme song to them. Whenever a boss is introduced, there's a boss jingle that leads them in before their actual theme. Most of the music is electronic crossed over with some heavy rock and grungy riffs, which has an upbeat 90s feeling to it. The game also knows when to adapt the motifs for proper effect, such as when Joe ends up having to battle a doppelganger whose theme song is a darker reprisal of his own theme song. Each level is based on a certain type of movie, such as the first level, which is an homage to vampire movies, or the third one, which is an underwater base reminiscent of an adventure spy movie. They also come complete with fun little chapter titles that are parodies of real movies. Each chapter has a clear-cut theme and idea that it sees through with, culminating with a satisfying boss battle that challenges you with everything you learned up to that point, creating an incredibly balanced difficulty curve throughout the campaign. The game isn't scared to infuse several set-piece moments either, with a hearty dose of common superhero tropes that occasionally get translated into actual gameplay, such as an intermission moment in the gameplay where you navigate Joe's superhero vehicle 6 machine, or have to escape a collapsing submarine. The influence of those hero tropes are what the game manages to embed into the heart and soul of its gameplay-driven story. Around the midway point, you're finally introduced to something of a rival of Joe's, and everyone knows a hero needs a worthy foil of similar skill, a recurring adversary who lives for the rivalry rather than the mission. It's also thanks to the mutual respect as rivals that Joe finally adopts a name for himself, and we get something of a quaint conclusion to a personal journey that permeated the first few chapters of the game, leaving Joe only with a final task at hand. The penultimate world of the game ends up being a boss rush. A lot can be said about being forced to replay elements of the game you've already once experienced, but boss rushes in games like these are usually something I can wholly sympathize with. Viewtiful Joe's journey of learning to be a hero and us improving as players throughout the game earns us a final exam. Back to back, this could be seen as a daunting challenge, but with hard development throughout the game we have a newfound view on those encounters, and it helps put things into perspective. Another thing I think Kamiya's games admit a whole lot is that for as hard as the games might be, it should never be said that they're not games that encourage and invite you to impress. I always get the feeling when playing Viewtiful Joe, or even Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, that Kamiya is the kind of director that really wants you to impress him, because the reward for besting the challenges ahead of you are always so satisfying. mostly due to how pleasing the gameplay itself is, but also because the game always provides you with a bombastic and satisfying payoff. After vanquishing the leader of the game's 5 big antagonists, it seems as if we've finally wrapped our quest up, until the ominous character who kidnapped Sylvia in the first place swoops back in to take her into the final frontier. The hardest challenge yet awaits, and the final level is now a gauntlet of everything you face in the game in terms of enemies, obstacles, and gimmicks. This still remains my favorite intergalactic level in any game due to how much of a satisfying and sensible conclusion it is for a game which bases everything it knows about cinema. And then comes the big plot twist. It turns out after all the heroics you've accomplished, the villain of the movie all along was none other than Captain Blue himself, the creator of Movieland and former hero of the movie, who's grown disillusioned with his power and the insignificance of his world, looking to take over the world outside of the movie. To do this, they need the DNA of the creator, Sylvia, and as such we get a cheeky little Star Wars reference squeezed in and it makes for good measure, because really, can you even have one of these things without one? Finally, Joe seizes control and steps up to the plate, no longer able to sit idly as just his sidekick, and you partake in a mech-on-mech showdown that determines the fate of the world. This is easily the most intense battle of the game in terms of spectacle, as you take control of the planet-sized 6 Majin to battle the omnipotent King Blue. The game could have ended here, the battle is a grand spectacle, but then it doesn't. The entire game from start to finish is designed as a learning experience of the game's mechanics and the hardships of heroism, and it does so elegantly through its incredibly challenging obstacles, set pieces, plot twists, and character beats. It's easy to get so lost in the moment while saving the world, which Joe himself does at one point in the game, that you forget the value of the crazy things you've gotten to experience themselves. But after the galaxy-sized showdown, the game decides to throw one final curveball to bring itself figuratively back to Earth and remind the player of what the heart, soul, and core of the game itself is. About true heroes. While this is by no means the hardest boss battle in the game, it is easily the most memorable one, as it serves as a perfect bookend to everything you've gone through on your adventure. The game starts off early on with a series of tutorial fights against Captain Blue, and to cap everything off is one more battle for the road, where no one holds any punches. This is no longer a battle for the fate of the world, but a battle between two heroes who are at their peak level, except this is your journey and Joe's journey, how the two of you have reached this point and gotten to the same level as the person you held as an inspiration, someone to supersede. Remember when I talked about leitmotifs? The final battle triumphantly combines and remixes Joe and Blue's signature themes, and I have to be honest with you, the entire starting moment with that music on top of it never stops sending chills down my spine. Mirror battles in games like these have always been my favorite. When they're upheld as a thematic thread in games, they provide for a fantastic way for the player to prove the mastery of their skills with somewhat of an identical toolset, and it's a way for the player to feel empowered, since it means that rather than tools themselves being what define the characters, it's the skill you have in using them. Viewtiful Joe takes that entire concept and places it at the very core of its payoff, making for one of the most incredibly satisfying in-games in any game I've ever played. You want to beat Captain Blue, not just because you want to save the world, but because you admire him for his heroics, because he was the key motivating figure in all of this, and you want to prove that you have what it takes to become an even greater hero. If there's any point in the story where it becomes clear that the game and its creators fully acknowledge heroes as the concept they embody, it's with the poignant and tragic ending reveal of Blue's Turn to Darkness. Blue confesses to the fact that he used to be hailed as a critically successful filmmaker who'd fallen into obscurity and irrelevance, when the only thing he wanted in life was to create stories and heroes that were meant to inspire and bring joy to people. After literally being sucked into one of his roles, he got to live out the fantasy of being a hero, but soon lost touch with reality, his family, and eventually became resentful of humanity having brushed away his contribution to the world as if it were nothing. Honestly, this scene really gets to me. For one thing, it doesn't help that the music that plays during this segment is a rearranged version of Sugimori's very own iconic classroom trial theme from Ace Attorney 1, which is one of the most tragic themes and moments in video games. But more importantly, it's probably the most self-conscious moment of the entire game, because more than just a tragic backstory, it's something of a common creator's plight. It's easy to lose sight over the concept of why we try to inspire and through what means we can hope to do so. But in the end, I think no matter what turn we take in life, there's no doubt in my mind that whether we know it or not, we often bring out the best in people without us realizing. In this case, Captain Blue's heroics, in spite of his subsequent villainy, ended up inspiring a brand new hero, Viewtiful Joe, and managed to piece together a great movie while at it that not only did the audience love, but more importantly, was something the person closest to him loved. And who doesn't love a happy ending, right?
Look, Blue. Everybody loves a happy ending.
Viewtiful Joe ends on a sequel teaser and the warning that there would still be 2 more times when the Earth would be in danger, suggesting that the story of Viewtiful Joe was meant to be covered as an obvious movie trilogy sort of setup. But what was to become of the franchise moving onward? Well, surprisingly enough, Viewtiful Joe was so well received critically and with a modest enough commercial success that Capcom fast-tracked a sequel for the subsequent year. Viewtiful Joe 2 was developed by Clover Studios, which was a semi-autonomous development company for Capcom that was spawned out of Team Viewtiful. Kamiya wasn't able to helm the directorial effort for this one because he was appointed to make a new IP for Clover, which would eventually become arguably his most critically acclaimed title ever made, Okami. However, he did write the story for Viewtiful Joe 2, which follows up immediately where the original game left off, with Joe and Sylvia now becoming a superhero duo fending off the next big threat. Sylvia becomes a playable character with projectile kick-based fighting style and her own VFX power, Replay, that replays whatever attack she used to increase damage. As far as sequels go, it's pretty much more the same, a fairly straightforward follow-up that goes pretty much where you expect it to and still maintains almost everything about the original that made it so great in the first place. It maintains the movie world aesthetic, takes on more sequel tropes, and has a fairly charming story. Around this time, Viewtiful Joe grew into a fairly sizable Capcom franchise, enjoying 2 spin-offs, an anime that went on for 2 seasons, and several guest star appearances in Capcom's fighting games such as Tatsunoko vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, where he had a really big head for some reason. He also recently appeared in Archie Comics' Sonic and Mega Man crossover Worlds Collide, which had guest star appearances by several of the Sega and Capcom's franchises. Unfortunately, the promise of a 3rd and final iteration in the series never came to pass. Clover Studios ended up going defunct and was absorbed back into Capcom shortly after the release of their final game, God Hand, due to poor commercial performances of their titles, and the creative team that held Viewtiful Joe alive decided to leave Capcom in order to found their own independent studio, Platinum Games. Under Platinum, Kamiya ended up making Bayonetta as a spiritual successor to Devil May Cry, and the game included some nods to Viewtiful Joe. Kamiya has expressed interest in wanting to finish the story of Viewtiful Joe in the past, even though the likelihood of that ever coming to pass is slim. That said, after Bayonetta, Atsushi Inaba and Kamiya would convene together again in their first collaborative title as producer/director since Viewtiful Joe to make another Hero Tokusatsu style game in the form of the Wonderful 101, which could be argued is a spiritual successor to Viewtiful Joe and has even more homages to the game, including a cheeky blatant reference to the fact that the series never wrapped up. The Wonderful 101 is a game I have a lot of things to say about, really, but that's gonna have to be a story for another time. Viewtiful Joe is a game that arrived to me in a very specific moment in my life, and it was a time when I not only held heroes in high regard, but also a time when I knew I wanted to create. It's a game that is filled with so much love, it's so palpable everywhere in its presentation and gameplay. It emits a boatload of charm within its cheesy exterior that is balanced by the incredibly heartfelt and sincere soul it has. I can return to the game just to challenge myself, to enjoy some of the unlockable bonus characters, or just to have a good time. And I can also return to the game to remind myself just how life is beautiful. It's a game that wants to impress the player as much as it wants the players to impress the creators, and it's rewarding at every corner of accomplishment. The amount of passion that the developers had for this game goes as far as even the credits, which treats the player to fun movie parody posters and a roll call of the game's cast and cute little factoids to go along with it. And once more, the music is a perfectly placed marvel that not only is an original track, but a medley that subtly calls back to every stage track of the game, making for a beautiful moment of reflection. Really, at the end of the day, it's hard to call Viewtiful Joe anything but my #1 favorite game, even if it's a distinction occasionally shared because it's probably the one game that made me realize the most about myself and my interests in gaming. In this particular genre, it's a game that will give back to you just as much as you give to it, and it's something I cherish at every turn, as it's a love letter to true heroes. The people who we get inspired by, the people who we can inspire, and the people that we can be ourselves. The value of a true hero is something that I don't think can ever be appreciated enough, because at the end of the day, it drives us to move forward and bring more joy to the world in whatever capacity we may have as people. Whether it be an experience you've had in real life or specific media that's influenced you, we always learn more about ourselves through the things we come to enjoy. And for that reason, I don't think it's ever fair to assume that movies, games, music, or books are merely devoid distractions, since creations like these have shaped culture. They've shaped our world. They've shaped people. The last ability that resonance proves how these things matter. And it's why we hold not just some of these specific experiences in high regard, but also the characters that are associated with them. A hero is a lot of things, and ultimately I like to think that a hero as a concept is defined by how they can inspire and teach us something about ourselves. And if there's even just one person whom you have influenced in a positive manner, whether you know it or not, I'd say that makes you a hero too. Thanks for watching this episode of Ghastlycrate. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you guys in the future.